ปุ๊น้ำปุ๊นี่เขาปุ๊มันลูกมีหลายอันเลยให้เลือกมาดูราคานี่เท่าไหร่1,000 เหรียญจะมาถึงแล้วเป็นมันเป็นประวัติศาสตร์ผู้ต้องขังและผู้คุมขังที่นี่น่าจะเป็นของที่ระลึก
Welcome to the front of the Bluestone College, also called Pentridge Prison. It opened as a road building camp in 1850, was established as a fully fledged metropolitan prison in 1857-58, and then closed down in 1997. At its biggest, it held about 1,000 inmates. That number obviously varied a lot during the years. Initially, it was only 12 people, and it just kind of different cells were added, changed, remade, remodeled, and all that. 11 people were executed within these walls. Many more also died from murder, injury, old age, illness, suicide as well. But like I mentioned just before these walls existed, this was the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. That's important because about 500 metres down there, you've got Mary Creek. Mary Creek is called Mary Mary in Wurundjeri language. It stands for very rocky. That's because of all the massive formations of bluestone around here. It's a result of volcanic eruptions over the last 6 million years, which obviously brought molten rock and lava all the way down to where we're standing now. And bluestone, it's a very, very solid, sturdy, permanent stone. It lasts basically forever, and so the formations of bluestone around here were actually quite sacred sites to the Wurundjeri people, and also, obviously, as a water source, the lake was very good for hunting and gathering as well. The volcanic eruptions also brought really good, rich farming soil down here. That's important because when the European colonizers arrived, they saw this as really good farming land and started to set up farming societies. One of those was Pentridge, where we're standing now. This is kind of what it looked like in 1850. So it's called Pentridge after an Irish farmer called Thomas Pentridge. They eventually then changed the name to Coburg in the 1880s after the prison was built because they didn't want to be associated with the prison as much anymore because it was called Pentridge Prison. And so Coburg comes from Saxon Coburg, which is a duchy in Germany, and the local, I think it was a prince or a king was visiting, so they changed the name to kind of honour him. So 1850, very pastoral farming area around here. Melbourne's starting to be developed a little bit. Sydney's also developed quite a bit as well. And the governments want to try and link the two together. So they decide to build a road, Sydney Road, which is the kind of one going along the angle just there. And to do that, they use convict labour. So they build road building camps, basically just groups of mobile wooden huts acting as cells where prisoners would sleep in during the night. And then they'd spend their days either mining stone at the local quarries or paving the road itself. So as I mentioned, 12 prisoners initially came to Pentridge's road building camp where we are now. It's basically just where the main part of the prison is. It was about 5 miles walk from Melbourne CBD, from Old Melbourne Jail. They were chained at the ankles the entire time. They came up here and then started to get to work. Then something else happened in 1850 that kind of changed things quite dramatically. Does anyone know what I might be talking about? Yes, exactly. So gold was found in Ballarat, and that basically just changed everything. So in 1850, Victoria's white population is only about 75,000. By the end of the decade, it balloons out to 500,000 because there's a whole heap of issues. And as such, the crime rate just skyrockets. So all of these issues, basically, all these people coming in and through Melbourne mean there's a lot of things that need to be built, a lot of new housing, a lot of new infrastructure. It takes a lot of time. Also, most of the people coming in are quite poor themselves, so they don't exactly have the finances to spend a lot of things. They're always like, they need food, travel, tools, equipment, place to stay. If they go into the goldfields, they'll need to like rent the land and also get a gold license, which costs about $200 in today's money for just 1 year. So all these types of expenses mean that most of the new land, the new infrastructure that's being developed is very slum-like, which leads to a lot of petty crimes, things like prostitution, thievery, petty murder, things like that. This was also at a time when if you're homeless, you could be arrested and put in prison. And so obviously when there's just not the real housing built to sustain all these new people and they're very poor, there's a lot of homelessness happening. So that's one reason why the crime rate also skyrockets. It doesn't help that most of the police force actually left to go mine in the goldfields, so there's less people kind of looking after the city. And then at the goldfields themselves, there's also a lot of tension happening. So a lot of these people that are coming to mine are mostly European, a lot of Chinese, and then a lot of ex-convicts from around Australia, so Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales. So there's a lot of racial tensions happening, not just with the Chinese, who are viewed as very kind of different and other by the European miners, but also amongst the Europeans. It's a very nationalistic time. There's a lot of German, French, English, Scottish, Irish, all these nationalities. They're not exactly on the best of terms. And then also socially and politically as well, there's been a massive wave of revolutions in Europe in 1848, called the Springtime of the People. Basically every country had some form of revolution, was trying to increase like voting rights, land rights, and things like that, and uplift the working classes. So a lot of them are bringing some of those ideas down to Melbourne. Some of them were a little bit violent. Some of the revolutions were kind of violent as well. So all of those are starting to kind of mix in the goldfields and just make it quite a very high tension place. And it's made worse by the fact that gold is relatively lucky. So mining gold, you can mine all day, every day for a month, and not really find anything. Someone would come in next to you, stare at there's a gold nugget kind of beneath their feet. So that type of thing as well leads to things like thievery, homelessness, running out of money, and things like that as well. So basically all that is to say that the crime rate skyrockets and Old Melbourne Jail is very quickly overwhelmed. So they need to look at other avenues to host all these new prisoners they have. And their first choice is cargo ships. Turn them into prison hulks. So basically there's 5 cargo ships that are abandoned by their crews in Port Phillip Bay who went over to mine in the goldfields. They were permanently moored down in Point Gellibrand in Williamstown. All the masts and rigging were taken away so the prisoners can try and escape and sail away. But it's kind of hard to describe just how rough and bad the conditions on these ships were. So you were on the bottom of a cargo ship is where they made the cells. So there's all the dirty bilge water. You don't have really any lights, any sewage, any running water, very poor ventilation. If you did have any ventilation, it probably meant that you had a porthole quite near the waterline, so if there's any high seas, the water would lap into your cell. You're changed 24/7 to prevent escapes. And of the 5 ships, only 2 were used for rock breaking, and on only those ones were you allowed out during the day. So the only way you would get off these ships during the day is if you were doing hard labour rock breaking yard. If you weren't, you were just on there 24/7. So absolutely miserable conditions, led to a lot of quite violent escape attempts, and one notable thing as well, which was the murder of an Inspector General called John Price, who was coming to inspect the conditions. They presented him with a petition. He didn't like their petition and gave them some extra years on their sentence, and they beat him to death. So quite horrible conditions. And so the government really decided that they needed a new prison. A new metropolitan prison, kind of far enough out that there's space to expand it, but close enough where they can transport prisoners quite easily. Pentridge fulfilled that for a couple of reasons. 1, it is a good location. 2, you've got great deposits of bluestone around, so you can build the walls quite easily. And the rich farming soil means it can also be self-sustaining. So in 1857-58, the Inspector General of Victorian penal establishments, a man called William Champ, was basically given the job and the funding to kind of create the new look of the prison. Prisoners themselves are actually the ones that built it. They mined the stone themselves and they built the walls themselves. But William Champ and his team designed it. And you can kind of tell the design they were looking for. So there's arrow slits behind me, there's crenellations along the walls, which are like the checkered things, and big striking towers. There's actually a big heavy wooden oak gate at the front as well. It was all designed to look like a European medieval castle. And this is to kind of suggest a really permanent sense of the prison, also to make it feel like it's hard to get into and hard to get out of. It's also not exactly the most pleasant and inviting thing. Like even walking past them through it now, it's not exactly the most inviting thing to walk through, but it is what we're going to do now as I take you to the old muster yards. So follow me. So I'll just point something out as we're walking along. Like I mentioned, we just passed through the main front gate, which was the big heavy wooden oak door that's been replaced by a roller door. And then we passed through another gate. Now we're going to pass through another gate, and then all the way down at the end you see another gate. So it's obviously a deliberate design by the prison to have a lot of walls and a lot of gates. Physically, it's just harder to get out of. You have more things to get through or over, but it's also a lot more confusing. So if you're in a place you haven't been to before, and there's all these walls and gates around you, you don't really know kind of where to go. I'm just going to be swinging around this way, sorry. And also psychologically, it's limiting where you can go. So outside of the prison, you can pretty much go wherever you want. As you get into the prison, it's not the case. Even your own cell, that's not really something that you can necessarily always go to whenever you want. And also a prison guard can go in there whenever they want, turn it upside down. So you don't really have any private space, any personal space or property in the prison. And it's a deliberate psychological trick, that's it. So here we're standing in the old muster yards. Basically, if you don't know what muster is, just lining up to be kind of counted and organised for the day. So you can see in the landscape of all these white lines is where they would be lined up. And basically 3 times a day, 8 a.m, 12 o'clock, so midday, and then 4:15 p.m. And this is also where you're given the jobs for the day. So it's a self-sufficient prison. All the jobs that prisoners might have had are actually on the crosses, if you want to wander around later. So basically anything you can think of, a prisoner was probably doing it. So I already mentioned that the walls were built by prisoners. So you would have quarrymen who would go down to Coburg Lake, which is where the quarry used to be, and they would mine big heavy chunks of stone, kind of like the size of those ones on the wall there. And then you'd have stonemasons. Stonemasons would take those big heavy chunks, put it into the walls or chisel it down so it's a smaller, kind of more manageable size. But they're doing this 6 days a week, so they're pretty much, they get quite good at it. Even if you don't start off as a stonemason, by the end of it you do have some skill in the craft. So you can start to do things like those stone lions on the plinth there, the corner new stone flower pot just there, that's got horses chiseled into it as well. So you can see those types of touches that they do start to add to it. I mean, it is their prison, they are building the walls, but if you have this skill and you're doing it 6 days a week, you kind of want to show off what you can do as well. You'd have farm labourers working about 60 acres of farmland that was just beyond that wall there. They would be doing everything a farm labourer would do. You'd have people making boots and clothes, people making all the tools at a blacksmith's. They had piggeries, tanneries, bakeries, people just like cooking food and everything like that as well. So literally everything you can pretty much think of was done by a prisoner.
Is that in this area?
Sorry?
Or inside?
So in the different spaces where they would do it. So
okay, in open space?
Yeah, depending on what it was.
Oh, okay.
So like the farmland was just beyond that wall there. The quarry is Coburg Lake, which is kind of just down there.
Yeah.
They had like different workshops in different areas.
Oh, okay.
Just beyond that wall there is what's called Industry Lane.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s, they eventually stopped it being a self-sufficient prison, got rid of all the farmland, but they still had industry yards to make things for the outside. So things like number plates and soft toys and things like that. So that was normally done in Industry Lane, which is just beyond that wall there.
Yeah.
Just went left through that gate.
Okay. So there wasn't any shed even in the rainy days.
It depended on what job you were doing, basically. But very, very little bother was really given to prevent rain and things like that.
Yeah.
If you're outside, you're outside. If you're inside, you're inside.
Yeah. Okay.
And you'll see one thing where then at the very end they didn't have any cover when you had to do exercise.
Yeah.
So anything like that. But yeah, so like I just said, in the 1950s they kind of stopped doing all the self-sufficient stuff. Also in the mid-20th century they stopped this being the muster yard and started doing musters inside the cells. And that's where they turned this just into a recreational space. So as a recreational space, this was a privilege, not a right. So if you ever did the wrong thing, you would lose that privilege. But if you were good, you would enjoy a swimming pool where that water feature is. You'd have on a 5 here at the prison, you'd have basketball courts, tennis courts, things like that as well.
Wow.
So again, it's a privilege, not a right, and it's still not, like, it's still a prison, but it's better than nothing. But it did kind of symbolize a little bit of a shift towards allowing prisoners a little bit more relaxation and recreation all the time, as opposed to pretty much just continuous labor and kind of getting yourself to be a better citizen through work, basically.
So the Division B, is this one for Division B or H?
B.
B. So B are dangerous criminals, like murderers?
B Division had two roles. The first is, we'll talk about in a little bit, and then the second one, they turned it into the division for high-risk prisoners.
Okay.
So H Division was for the maximum security division, mostly for prisoners who tried to escape, either here or anywhere else in Victoria. B Division, that was mostly for just high-risk prisoners who maybe haven't escaped, but they're still deemed to be high risk, whether for the crime they did or for how they're kind of acting within the prison. They might not be as bad, like they might not be bad enough to go down to H, but they're still deemed high risk.
So it's like a shoplifter will be in the same location of a murderer, something like that?
It depends.
Okay.
So there's different divisions for different people, and it also depends how you're acting inside the prison as well. So again, a lot of these things are privileges, not rights. So if you are constantly bad, you lose privileges, and you also might be kind of put into more, not more dangerous cell blocks, but more restrictive cell blocks compared to other ones over here. But now we're just going to go a little bit further, and I'll point out more of the different divisions. So on the left here, we have E Division. That was mostly the prison hospital. There was a couple of decades where it was a dormitory cell block. There was a couple of decades where it was a dormitory cell block for about 8 to 12 prisoners, but for the most part it was a prison hospital and kind of dentistry area. And then we also have the shopping centre behind me. So the shopping centre is the site of what was called C Division. It was knocked down in the 1970s, and it was actually known to be kind of one of the most archaic kind of cell blocks they had here at Pentridge. So this is what it looked like. Now you can't really tell from this picture, but it is actually also designed differently to most of the other cell blocks. So you can see with B Division, it's designed in the shape of a cross, so you have one wing, one wing, one wing, one wing. C Division was actually 6 rows of cells, either backed onto one another or on top of one another. And this caused a lot of issues, especially combined with the fact that this never had any sewage or running water or electricity for its entire history. So that meant that the stench that would accumulate from this lack of sewage just kind of lingered, and there was no real way to get out of it, to get rid of it. Whereas in B Division, if you opened up a door at the end of each wing, you could get a kind of airflow going to kind of circulate. But C Division just never had that. So it did mean that it was really rife with disease and also really, really smelly. The prison guards were known to have to kind of brace themselves when they opened up in the morning for the stench that would come at them. Some of them also had to call it Dodge City, because if prisoners didn't like you, they would try and throw their slop buckets onto them. So yeah, just a very miserable place for all involved. It was basically, we don't exactly know why it's so different to everyone else, to every other cell block, but it was for petty criminals. So you wouldn't be spending too much time in there, maybe a couple of weeks, a couple of months, but it was still horrendous to live in. Unfortunately, also because it was mostly petty criminals, it meant disproportionately a lot of the Indigenous prisoners that were here at Pentridge were in C Division. Just keep following me a little bit further. Around this corner we've got A Division. So if anyone's doing the combo, you'll hear a lot more about H Division, which is one wing of A Division. But A Division is actually built on the outside of the original boundary walls here at Pentridge. So you can all see this photo here. This dark checkered line here is the original boundary walls that they built, and A Division is this one up the top. So it's actually built on the outside for a very specific reason, and that is the women. So A Division held the women only for a couple of years, but initially it was built on the outside of the prison walls because they wanted to separate the men and the women and kind of create a little bit of a boundary between them. There was a Royal Commission into Victorian penal establishments in the 1880s, which discovered that they still thought it was far too close for their liking, and so that's when they decided to build D Division, roughly where those cranes are, and move the women out there. At the same time as they did that, they also then gave them separate female prison guards, because whilst they were in A Division, they still had male prison guards, and they were realising that there was a lot of cases of abuse happening between the guards and the prisoners. When the women moved out there, they stayed until about the 1950s when they built Fairley Prison down in Fairfield. That was a separate female metropolitan prison, so all the female prisoners moved out there. And then they came back when there was a fire in Fairley Prison in the 1990s, and stayed for, I think it was only a couple of years in B Division Annex, which I believe is that one just there, until the cells were rebuilt. Whilst they were in B Division Annex, they were under constant supervision. They were isolated in their cells for like 16 hours a day, so there was a number of them that committed suicide. But then they did eventually go back into Fairley Prison. So even though Pentridge is normally thought of as a men's prison, women have been in and out of it for all bar a couple of decades, basically. For A Division, when they moved the women out there, had a couple of roles, but eventually it settled as the low-risk prison cell block. So as I was talking about, B Division was the high-risk cell block, where you're kind of restricted, and it's for prisoners who are deemed high risk. A Division, prisoners who are deemed low risk. So you have a little bit more access to amenities, a little bit less restrictions, a little bit more privileges, because you're deemed as a good, kind of safe prisoner who's probably not going to try and escape or commit any very heinous crimes, like trying to kill anyone or anything like that. And then we have B Division, which is where we're just about to go into. So with B Division, initially it was what was called the separate and silent cell block. So basically this is where you're kept under constant social isolation for 1 month a year of your sentence. So if you came for 5 years in October, every October you'd spend completely isolated, either 23 hours a day inside your cell, and then 1 hour of isolated exercise outside in what was called a panopticon area. So that system I'll explain a little bit about at the very end, because we'll have a final stop in one of the old panopticon airing yards. You'll also hear a little bit about it inside the audio tour as well. Basically, it was part of a system to try and break you down, and then you come back out into prison proper, and you'd be built back up. That stopped in around the 1920s, and that's when they turned it into that high-risk prison cell block. But now we're just going to go into the chaplain's office.
What's the reason we have a course for B Division and H, but we don't have for B?
So different areas are owned by different companies. And
okay.
It just also costs a lot to do things. So E Division is owned by a company called Brewdog.
So it's, they're using it for as a...
Yeah, so it's a restaurant.
It's a restaurant.
But this is just where with the recording from now on. Welcome to the Panopticon area. So, a couple of quick things. One, what is a Panopticon? It means all seeing, so pan, all, opti-seeing, all seeing. They've basically built 8 of them in the entire world. This is one of 3 that were here at Pentridge. And this is where you do your 1 hour of mandated exercise under the separate and silent regime. So all of you will probably have heard from the separate and silent cell in there. You're basically doing 23 hours a day inside a cell exactly like that one. Where all you can do is read the Bible and think, and that's it. This is happening for a month at a time. And then you come out here and you do 1 hour of mandated exercise. So basically each prisoner would have 1 wedge. Before you'd come out, you'd have to don masks, and also you'd be walking on carpets. So this is part of the system, because this entire system is designed to break you down and remove your sense of self. So the masks is because you're not allowed to see anyone's face, so they can't see your face either, to remove your sense of self. This entire month, you're not referred to by your name, you're only referred to by a number, and you're meant to make no noise, basically, at all. All of this is designed to break you down. It's part of a system designed by a man called Jeremy Bentham. He was born in the mid-1700s, and he was actually quite a radical progressive thinker for his time. So you're thinking kind of late 18th century, late 17th century, early 18th century. He was a big supporter of equality for women. He wanted to decriminalise homosexuality. He was really against animal cruelty and fought for animal rights, so things like that. So quite progressive thinking. But he, like a lot of people at the time, thought the criminality was basically innate within a person. So you're basically born a criminal. You weren't necessarily made a criminal from circumstance or anything like that. And so his idea of how to stop that, because if people are basically innately criminal, what's the point in releasing prisoners? They're just going to end up re-offending. So his idea to stop it is to break someone down to the absolute basic core self, and then you can build them back up into a model Christian citizen. So this is all the breaking down. So you're slowly eroding someone's sense of self. You have nothing to do inside yourself besides read the Bible. That's just trying to instill some Christian values in you, and also to make you incredibly bored. So when you go outside into the prison, you want to do things with your day, so you want to do some of the jobs that are available. And even this hour of exercise, there's not much to do. So once you've done your mast, you and 12 prisoners would walk out here, and you're given a wedge each. So this frame is how high the walls were, and basically you were surrounded on 3 sides by walls. So one on one side, one on the other side, and then one in front of you as well. And then you'd have a big guard tower in the middle. So this is where the panopticon idea comes from this guard tower. You'll actually see the windows are latticed. So the prisoners had no idea what the guard in there was actually doing. Whether they were looking at you, they might be looking at someone else, they might be taking that. You just have no idea. And that was the deliberate part of the design as well. So it's meant to make you always feel like the state is there ready to catch you the moment you do something wrong. Even if you don't see them, they're there. And so when you go out into the wide world, if you think about like stealing an apple, you think, I better not. I don't see the state there ready to catch me and put me back in prison, but I know they're there and I know they will catch me if I do.
There's cameras around there.
And that's what it's trying to kind of instill in people. And basically all you're doing is just walking in little laps for about an hour. The only place that's really open to you is the sky above you. And even that's somewhat deliberate because that's where God and heaven is. And even that's trying to somewhat instill the idea that God's always looking down at you and judging you. Because you think all you can do during the day is read the Bible. So you're coming from reading the Bible to coming out here where the only thing you can really do is look up into the sky and walk in a circle. So again, similar to the state, it's meant to make you think, better not do anything wrong, God will judge me harshly for it. They stopped this system in the mid-1920s. Basically, they thought initially it was really good, but they realized it just wasn't working. It just turns people into paranoid messes. I mean, we know from today that social isolation is just terrible for creatures like us. We're really social creatures. We need social interaction with one another. And so that combined with the feelings of the state always watching you and God always watching you just turned people into really paranoid messes. It didn't actually rehabilitate them in the slightest. So when they did that, when they stopped that, they knocked the con down and just turned this into a regular exercise yard for the high-risk prisoners that were kept here. So as a regular exercise yard, you can actually see where they gravelled over the foundations, so you can see where the gravel came up through that white line along the bottom. But they would just be socialising, maybe kicking the ball against the wall, doing some exercise and things like that. And finally, I'll just point out one more thing, and that's that cross on the wall there. So that cross actually represents something quite significant and notorious that happened here at Pentridge, and that's the escape of Ronald Bryant and Peter Walker, because that was from this exercise yard, from that spot. So the year is 1965. Ronald Bryant's heard that his wife's going to divorce him, so he wants to escape, patch things up with her, and then run away with the family to Brazil. So he enlists the help of his friend, Peter Walker, and together they start to make their escape. They chose the 19th of December because that's the day of the officers' Christmas party that year. So it's a skeleton crew here at Pentridge. There's only one prison guard kind of monitoring this area in that guard tower, a man by the name of Helmut Munder. So he has to watch over this entire area. And what you'll see is, if you go there later, where that cross is, there's actually a blind spot. So you can't see the guard tower can't see you. So that's already a pretty good advantage. They also have lots of things in here that they can use. So there's some benches they use to stack up to kind of make like a ladder. So they get over the first wall relatively fine, but the second wall is the main issue. So to stop the prison guards seeing them once they try and get over the second wall, they have some friends stage a fight over in another corner, so the guards' attention is diverted. And they actually use a grappling hook. So they've tied bed sheets together to make rope. They've got a piece of scrap iron from the industry yards that they've smuggled in. And there's a piece of railing that runs along the top of the wall. So they fling up the grappling hook, attach it to that, and scale up to the wall. They then run along and overwhelm Lung in the guard tower and take his rifle, force him to open the doors of the guard tower. Now the way these guard towers works is there's two levers at the top that operate both doors at the bottom. One door goes into the prison, one door goes out. So Helmut Lange knows that the longer he delays, the more likely the alarm will be raised and the escape will be stopped, so he deliberately opens the wrong one first. Ronald Ryan obviously has no idea how these doors operate, so he doesn't know until he's run down, figured it's the wrong one, and has to run back up again. Helmut Lange at that stage is out of options. They have a gun, so he opens the correct door, and they do make their escape. They accost a Salvation Army chaplain who happens to be walking by and attempt to start marching him towards Sydney Road with the intention of stealing his vehicle, but he says he just walked to work that day. So they bash him over the back of the head and continue on to Sydney Road to try and steal another vehicle. As that's happening, the alarm has been raised though, so prison guards start lining the walls and streaming out from the prison to try and stop the escape. Some of the guards have rifles, so they start to take a couple of shots at the escaping pair. Ronald Ryan has the rifle he took from Helmut Lange, so he takes a couple of shots back. In the middle of that gunfight, a prison officer by the name of George Hodgson is shot and killed, and then Ronald Ryan and Peter Walker do manage to make their escape and go on the road for 19 days before they're recaptured. During those 19 days, there is another incident. A citizen recognizes them and tries to make a citizen's arrest. Peter Walker responds by punching him so hard in the sternum that he later dies from internal damage. So when they are recaptured, he's given manslaughter, so he's given the charge of manslaughter and life in prison. Ronald Ryan is the one that was holding the gun during the escape, and so he is charged with the murder of the prison officer. Now, as you've heard in there, there's a lot of discrepancies and issues with the trial from a lot of people. A lot of people to this day don't necessarily believe his guilt fully. A couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of discrepancies in the eyewitness testimonies. Some say Ronald Ryan was standing while firing his rifle, some say he was kneeling, and that does affect the trajectory of the bullet, which they would have been able to determine through ballistics and things like that. And if they found the bullets, they would have just easily connected the bullets, the shell casings, to the rifle, and it would have been clear, but they didn't really do that.
So how many people he killed in total?
He just killed one.
But after escape, he also killed
So after his escape, his partner was the one who punched the person in the stomach and caused him to die.
Okay. Not killing, but I mean caused to
Yeah, so it was given manslaughter because it wasn't deemed that he was trying to kill him per se. He was just trying to stop him trying to make a citizen's arrest on him. So Ronald Ryan is convicted of the crime. There's discrepancies. Obviously, I don't know. No one nowadays knows. It's just going to go down. It's one of those things that we'll never really know the answer to. But what exacerbated all this tension around the case is the fact that it was the death penalty that he was going to receive. And that is something that hadn't been used in Australia in about 15 years, since the hanging of Jean Lee and two others. And most of Australia's population by this time didn't really agree with the death penalty being the appropriate form of punishment. And so that just exacerbated everything. Now, when he was given the charge, there was hope that he might get at least a lessened sentence. That wasn't to be. That's because the Victorian Premier at the time, Sir Henry Bolte, decided that he wanted to appear tough on crime for an upcoming election, and so he just said the next person to be hanged, like the next person to be sentenced to be hung, is getting hung. And so when it came to the day, even though there had been a couple of years of attempted plea bargains and deals and things like that that all fell through, he eventually was just given the charge, and then on the 3rd of February 1967, Ronald Ryan woke up. He woke up from H Division, which is where the condemned cell is. He was led down to D Division. He spent a couple of hours with Father John Brosnan.
อันนี้ก็ทัวร์ก็จบลงแล้วนะคะ ข้างในจะเป็นห้องขัง ข้างในเขาไม่ให้ถ่ายวิดีโอก็เลยถ่ายไม่ได้ค่ะ แต่ว่าวันนี้เราก็จบลงแค่นี้นะคะบ๊ายบายเดี๋ยวเราจะพาไปเที่ยวที่อื่นอีกบ๊ายบายค่ะ